Lindsey Graham and other Confederate enemies of the United States, holding themselves as enemy combatants to destroy the government and overthrow its people and permanently bar all constitutional functions, actively seeks the function of active war against the civilians of these United States in order to bar rights in a full, diverse mechanism, which facilitates his white supremacist communism to have the exclusive Soviet vote over all elections, making anyone who gets elected or possible to be elected preordained by the Soviets and not the American people who he holds in contempt as an enemy of war. And to this extent, the United States military is not authorized to act inside the United States, and thus the extension of the military through presidential powers, which includes the intelligence operations, is likewise not authorized to do so. And to this extent, you have the active function of intentional malicious treason by its core definition, and thus the action of treason having any meaning whatsoever is his blatant intent in his misbehavior against the functions of law, in his subversion of law, in his support and endorsement and acceleration of anarchy, such as for the function of the lynch mobs against American civilians in American jurisdictions. This, as an extension of its various duplicitous functions, includes the diverse phantom cells which have been expressed throughout the United States in order to accelerate state authorities above federal constitutional authorities, subverting the very concept of ordered hierarchy. To this extent, one state might overthrow other states and force it through its covert warfare to capitulate according to the practice coups of the CIA against the other states, forcing them into the Fugitive Slave Act under the function of the Fugitive Slave Act, which is a compulsion of states' rights against states' rights, and thus the action of one state's right to be a slave raider is not the other state's rights to challenge, even in its own jurisdiction, as the other state is in fact not a sovereign state, as the concept of government does not exist for their kind, which had designed the Nazis as a blueprint to study and accelerate under Project Overcast and Project Paperclip and many of the predecessors, which are still covert, which facilitated the capacity of double agents loyal to fascism in the FBI and others to use Wall Street money in order to create the Nazis under the fake public position that they would not be able to fund military actions, as it was supposed to be a civilian counter to the war debts which were exhausting them, and thus the action of actively protecting the funding of the war effort is what Lindsey Graham is doing. The creation and cultivation and perfection of America's enemies, which he intends to centralize all authorities away from the judiciary and the legislative into the executive, away from the president, so that it can be sold to those enemies, which is his living, ongoing crime, which they seek by various frauds of customs without reasons, including his mechanisms of human trafficking and economic terrorism by economic hitmen, in order to subvert the function of speech at every level, by which any competitor might be able to challenge, must be brutalized and censored in secret, and thus slandered according to the functions of their extraordinary surveillance powers under the trained discipline of coups and the destruction of people throughout the world in subjugation to the interest of the United States government used against the American government, and to this end becomes the perpetual disguise under abuse theaters in order to express whatever arbitrary narrative they wish, including the illegal war on terror, which facilitated the expansions well beyond the definitions of Congress, being itself in breach of the authority of Congress and thus beyond the authority of war. And to this extent, the self contradictions are not lost on Lindsey Graham, but the objective by his eternal contempt for adversaries of white supremacists and their communism, and the extension of the permanent protection of any remedy to a secret conveyed by the Confederacy against the United States would be protected from being challenged according to his interest in his plot under hybrid warfare to destroy these United States, which of course requires the arresting and restraints and subversions and defamations by those military powers under the military intelligence to engage in these increasing powered strives for usurpation in order to assert the destruction by the targeting of his estimate of who the Americans would have established as valuable, and to destroy them, and to defame them, and to ruin them, so that the Americans, seeing them with the wrong context, might disdain them and refuse to restore what is rightfully owed, and thus under their devil religion, have made the victim guilty of the crime, and to the ends that the victim is guilty of the crime, the perpetrator, having escaped holistically, having disconnected himself, allows for the rest of the coup to take place, as they have redelegated under the terror factory the terrorist plots designed by the FBI and others in order to express their larger military campaign to overthrow the government. And under this hybrid warfare, every remedy which would have been otherwise meant would be undermined in every meticulous way which could be designed, and thus the position of even position that you would have to compensate the person the entirety of the things that they would have been owed had they not been obstructed, and thus the action of justice through a receiver is then even subverted by the capacity of the white supremacist communism of having pre-established who gets to do the thing as a double agent conducting it for their own ambitions, which means they would refuse to do the job correctly, undermining it in the remedy, which would require a separate entire remedy in order to enact it, requiring David Bowles' security protocols from the zombie insurance and others in order to create a series of checkpoint restraints against it, such as the function of primary investments that David would have made as the patriarchy heading up many of the other victims, which would then derive the position of what they assumed to be something along the lines of 7 layers of $800 billion coalition businesses, which would form the function of things that David would have created as a functioning network as a primary employer in these United States. And to this extent, the function would have to be limited to the act of the Confederacy state, which is a necessary prerequisite for the black community in order to sell their debts according to the contract schedule which they had arranged, and thus the action of filling it with the businesses in question through those receiverships are necessary, and thus the action of the receivership exclusively being capable of the sale and distribution for David's immediate liquidation of those resources to be constructed under the receivership for the Confederate government facilitates the permanent state of what they are capable of conducting despite these subversions, and thus the action of those that would owe the position according to the original sales under that contract schedule, would then be compelled to get the loan in order to pay David for those things to manage the oversight of the receiver of the purchased product of the contract list and its properties, which would have been established, which for the Confederacy, which is a series of states under the contract schedule, to be at the border between the United States and Mexico in the desert as a secondary rebuff of the border wall, especially in areas that have been compromised or do not possess a wall, would directly have access to the United States without the wall, would by definition immediately be transferring into the Confederacy, at which point their escape from Mexico into the United States would not exist, as they would be escaping directly into the white supremacist nation, which is not America. But would be subjugated to the United States as a prison state for the white supremacist Confederacy, which by definition are separatists leveraging these wars to overthrow the government, and those businesses being designed as compensation for the debts owed to the black community would be owed as businesses in many cases as a compulsion to those communities, which would have to build them and be their superiors and owners and supervisors, at which point the work would then be conducted by the white supremacists who would have supported the coups against the United States, according to David's investigations, to be sentenced to the Confederacy, which would be required to have work, which requires those businesses to exist, making by definition this an essential function. Elsewhere, the other functions of David's core identity, according to its obstructed work, would have to repair the others, at which point the function of those complications, despite the subversion by the insurrectionists, would require the restoration of the School of Hard Knocks, which would require them to remove all counters to its existence, such as in the 90s Lindsey Graham's attack on the education systems by forcing all education to get certified through their pre-adorned wizard system by the certification of the white supremacist Confederacy and their military industrial educational complex. And being fully disconnected from this, the School of Hard Knocks would not be subject to it, and thus you would have to remove this racist policy specifically designed to target David and his systems, and thus the correction against these Bill of Attainder and ex post facto Confederate policies being removed in their entirety facilitates its reconstruction, and thus the action of the actual School of Hard Knocks legitimately being restored facilitates its primary purpose in that restoration, which facilitates the capacity to actual legitimate education for those who are owed it, and thus the action of its restoration facilitates the mechanism of the education prerequisite to non-insurgents inside of David's companies, who would then facilitate whatever they're supposed to be doing at every branch of hierarchy in every wage, which would fill out the rest of those systems, at which point the function would then materialize into the secret functions of David as the intelligence oversight, which they are all terrified of David because of, using Lindsey Graham's fight against the Bill of Rights under the policies of his war against the United States, having targeted David in order to remove that system, because by definition, Reagan would have, in the secret record, have targeted David under the basis of him being the intelligence oversight, which would facilitate his ability to arrest the president and enforce the impeachment, which is necessary, according to Trump's argument, to stop the president from being prosecuted under the various policies, and thus the action of arresting the Senate and its enforcement mechanism prevents the possibility of a legitimate impeachment, turning it into nothing but a show trial and a farce and a hooligans, and nothing except for a public smearing of anyone, and thus the action of the thing that it would pretend to be, according to Trump, is the thing that made it that thing, and thus it is inverted according to that logic based upon their hybrid warfare and its intimate study of magics throughout the world historically. And thus they create radicals to create the problems so they can apply their fake solutions and destroy anyone who would have provided an actual legitimate solution that wasn't a part of the racketeering scheme, which would then materialize the function of a challenge to their communism, which they would fight with absolute force, which would then be protected with absolute ferocities. And to this end, you have the perpetuation of the opposite of the Constitution as their core constitution in anti law or anarchy for the white supremacists in the definition of anarcho communism in practice by those Confederates. The issue with these broad anarchical terrorists is the function of the law of war policies that Lindsey would refer to, which facilitate any arbitrary person being targeted might, because exclusively of being a military-aged male, be convicted as an enemy combatant, and thus it, being fully subversive, can imbue the entire construct of hate crimes by a hate group, and thus the action of being a particular age, of a particular sex, of a particular race makes them the enemy arbitrarily, and thus the action facilitates no actual concept of scrutiny or justice, as the function of justice in courts are expensive and, under the stresses of war, gets ignored in favor of the convenient in the imminent, and thus the action of ignoring all legitimate processes is their core identity, as they are and have only been exclusively a clan rally for the function of kangaroo courts and the express enforcement of white supremacists in their arbitrary objectives of all hate crimes, including, but especially, social violence and economic violence, so that they might enforce their superiority, similar to the function of the white supremacists that overthrew and lynched those who were elected in North Carolina when a black government was elected, or the function of retaliation against a black community which was eradicated and drowned in a lake in order to disguise the crime of retaliating against their arbitrary, bitchy whims, as they established their sniveling retaliations out of juvenile inferiority and its complementary jealousies, which is the only thing that they actually have to say as a justification for their crimes. The assumption that somebody else made them feel inferior is the whole of the crime they would be punished for. The exact legal opposite of the constitutional right to liberty in its entirety, and thus the action of the Constitution and the concept of the Constitution is their fundamental enemy, and thus the capacity of forming a republic becomes their enemy, and thus the function of any challengers to their political ideals becomes their enemy, and thus the position says that if anyone challenges their Confederate policies which they wish to pass, shall be subject to every kind of war effort that they might be expressly destroyed by their terrorist organizations of the reformed non-service of law lynch mobs, conducting every type of terrorism in order to make living uncomfortable for them until individual civilians without a legal government might collapse other civilians as though it is an act of war, as though that they were some kind of mercenary brand for the phantom selves to enforce these arbitrary whims, and to that express purpose given themselves fake legitimacy, having infiltrated themselves into the government, materialized the threat to the general public requiring the government to arrest those parties, as they are and have always been enemies of war, which they so blazonly confess to, as they are and have always been guilty of treason. And how would you determine anything else except by a court of examination, by an investigation, which would require itself to acquire a legitimate conviction under civilian law? But by definition, that is the thing being rejected because they do not want challenges to whatever they want. They want to say that anyone convicted of being Muslim looking, it needs to be able to be convicted and arbitrarily taken by the Gestapo in the United States, or anyone convicted of looking or being affiliated with the Russians, such as the Russian ballerinas in the United States, which by definition have fully disconnected from Russia in its entirety and are exclusively expressing the culture of Russia in a complete rejection of Putin's government and an endorsement of the United States, which would then, at the same time, be completely repelled under these arbitrary whims by the white supremacist communism, which, providing the fake virtue signaling, only funded the position as a pump and dump so that they might extraordinarily fund the thing so that they can leave it in its entirety and get everyone else that would have stayed either way to leave by virtue of the accelerated pace of the collapse, facilitating the desperate position of Muslims not being able to sell food despite having been the top ranking restaurants or ballerinas from the Russians, who would have been a premier top ranked community service, completely ignored, having removed all of the funding from it. And thus you understand the nature of anarchy, which is the pretext function of what Lindsey Graham would want to do to them, as they would be sent to Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay or any of the others for those very same reasons that their businesses were collapsed, as a preparation to make them too weak in order to prevent them from the right to speech or the pursuit of the government for a remedy, in order to guarantee that they have no alternative means to be anything exclusively except for the position of a prisoner to be extorted and abused by these dominatrix freaks. And as that has been systematically proven, you would systematically observe their ignoring of military codes of ethics, military codes of justice, military codes of conduct, and thus those articles being fully rejected in favor of the anarchist white supremacist terrorism facilitates the function of secrecy over the function of even the military grade of justice, and to this extent, the full rejection of every competent translation of any meaning, as the function has, under many of the laws of war which they would find themselves normally restrained by, given in perpetuity the exception by the function of their hybrid warfare, manipulating the events under fraud, which they themselves are guilty of, which means that they would have to be arrested and punished for those actions, such as Project Northwoods, which conducted 9/11 and removed all air security to prevent it and all other security checks before then, which was approved and known of by them from the 1980s and previously, according to the function of those who have engaged in that action, such as the secret records version of Lindsey Graham using the secret function of the surveillance for those military court functions, and the subversion of those who were projected to be the American leadership on maturity, undermining national security and defense of its enemy. Scott Ritter, for example, historically positioned himself with Joe Biden to be able to conduct arbitrary, infinitely diverse operations, with operations that considered the exclusive limitation of it being a desirable thing to happen, despite the fact that it might not be accepted by the hierarchy, because they seek to do the terrorism from the plausible deniability aspect, engage in the function of not being able to negotiate with anyone, as the function of negotiating with terrorists is disqualified as fraudulent and subversive, and thus the action of the hierarchy negotiating with someone would then say that they would not conduct this action, which would then be bypassed by those parties, which would then facilitate the nullification of the negotiation, which would then certify the position that there would be no negotiations, increasing hostilities and the destruction of any potential diplomacy, which is the material goal of the white supremacists in their eternal adversarial nature to the function of order as a concept. And to these ends, and for this express purpose, you have their material war against these United States by those insurgencies conducting these malicious subversions. They are the ones who should be arrested for being terrorist enemies of the United States, and yet those are the ones most likely to be given the power to determine terrorists, and thus the action of its inverse position materializes their contempt and subversion and usurpation of the hierarchy, makes them guilty of the thing that they would punish the innocent for, which cannot be challenged because there is no trial, which would have provided evidence that they would obstruct, and thus the fact of criminalizing any evidence that would prove their innocence would materially be struck from the function, and anyone who would have provided it would have been thrown in prison, similar to the function of Ronald Reagan without David Bowles in order to arrest him for the impeachment, to engage in the function of the Iran Contras, which would naturally increase the function of his being arrested and impeached for his criminal actions and the conspiracies connected to him. And to this end, the function of the only one who actually received any jail time were the people who reported or supported the enforcement of the Iran-Contras against the insurgents' operations without legal authorization or authority, and thus the action of destroying David Bowles and the others who would have facilitated that counteraction prevented the capacity by the sedition to engage in any of those actions. And without David, the departments from his military branch with Congress, according to the theory that they used to abuse him, would have been the arresting party, which would have changed the power dynamics against the presidency, facilitating his and his predecessors and his posterity presidents from being able to conduct similar offenses, and thus their action of making war by the sedition, by their terrorism, to subvert the capacity of the government to conduct any kind of challenge to the position is a direct act of war against the United States and a clear use of usurpation. They are and have always been a insurrectionist coup, which is an expansion of the coups facilitated by the CIA trained around the world and perfected in its action, and thus the action of using those trained skills against the American people is the realized